Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back to Ream Library. I'm Tom Landy. I'm the director of the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture at Holy Cross. The McFarland Center sponsors and supports programs that foster dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual obligation. Together with the Kraft Hyatt Professor of Judaic Studies, Alan Avery Peck, and a committee of faculty colleagues who are dedicated to our work, we organized the Kraft Hyatt Fund for Jewish Christian Understanding. With support from the Kraft Hyatt Fund, we're able to host lectures and discussions like today's on Judaism, Jewish-Christian relations, Jewish history, and the Holocaust. In addition, the Kraft Hyatt Fund enables us to sponsor students, scholars, and residents, to underwrite faculty research and course development, and to offer study abroad opportunities to students. This year, we're proud to be offering a scholarship to one student for the Maymester program in Jerusalem that we helped to launch about a decade ago. She'll be studying Jewish spirituality and mysticism in the 21st century. So I encourage you to learn more about us by visiting the website holycross.edu/McFarland Center, where you'll also be able to tell your friends to see a recording of today's talk if they weren't able to be here or if they're not joining us on a broadcast right now. Today I'm really pleased to welcome Madga Teter, Professor of History and the Shvidler Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham University, to talk about her extensive research into Blood Libel, the anti-Semitic lie that inspired violence against Jews since the Middle Ages. Professor Teter is a scholar of early modern history, specializing in Jewish history, Jewish-Christian relations, cultural, legal, and social history, as well as the history of knowledge. Prior to joining Fordham University, she was professor of history and the Jeremy Zwilling Professor of Jewish Studies at Wesleyan University. She's author of Jews and Heretics in Catholic Poland, published in 2005, Sinners on Trial, Jews and Sacrilege After the Reformation, which she published in 2011, and the subject of her talk today, Blood Libel on the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, which was published in 2020. In this book, she follows a paper trail across Europe with sources in 8 countries and 10 languages to document how the development of the printing press in the mid-15th century enabled the diffusion of anti-Semitic words and images and provided a lasting template for hate. Widely acclaimed, Blood Libel is the winner of the 2020 National Jewish Book Award for writing with archival material, as well as the 2021 George L. Moss Prize from the American Historical Association. Professor Teter has also co-edited 2 volumes and has published many articles in English, Hebrew, Italian, and Polish. She's a fellow of the American Academy for Jewish Research and has been an NEH Senior Scholar at the Center for Jewish History, a Harry Starr Fellow in Jewish Studies at Harvard University, an Emmeline Bigelow Conlon Fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies, also at Harvard, and the Mellon Foundation Fellow at the Coleman Center for Scholars and Writers at New York Public Library. Please join me in welcoming Madga Teter.
Thank you so much. I have to say it's a very strange experience. This is my first in-person talk, the first time I haven't had a mask on, speaking in public outside of my home. And it is the first again, in-person talk since my book came out, because my book came out just a few weeks before COVID hit. And the Coleman Center of Scholars and Writers at the New York Public Library had the book launch in February, and then everything shut down. So I'm really honored, I'm really happy to be here with you and speak about my book. So when my book was going literally into printing, I had to stop it and add in the introduction a mention of this incident. In 2019, April 2019, a shooter in California attacked a synagogue, a Poway synagogue, and in his manifesto, online manifesto, which he posted as outlining reasons behind his actions, he mentioned a subject of my book, Simon of Trent. So among the whole screed, there is this sentence for their degenerate, abominable practices of sexual perversion and blood libel, you are not forgotten, Simon of Trent. The horror of that you and countless children have endured at the hands of the Jews will never be forgiven. This was a reference to a 1475 story, a story of a boy named Simon whose death during Easter and Passover season in March 1475 in the northern Italian city of Trento led to one of the most infamous and most notorious persecutions of Jews in European history. And it was when I began this book, not only was this story just important in the history of blood libels to me, but it wasn't. I didn't think it was going to play such a central role. I was also not really thinking about the contemporary reverberations of these medieval tales. But as I was doing the work, doing research, I kept coming up against these constant references. So here is one from a Facebook page, which was only removed by Facebook in January 2018, 4 years after the ADL requested its removal. And you can also see the image of Simon of Trent on that is in the sculpture there. Then there were reports, and here is an example of white supremacists in Britain visiting a tomb of Hugh of Lincoln in the Lincoln Cathedral. He was a boy whose death led to, again, a persecution and execution of Jews in 1255 in Lincoln, England. And then I was aware of this iconography, but again, it was not something that I was engaging in. I was aware of the fact how the blood libel iconography became appropriated in anti-Israel rhetoric in the Middle East. And here you can see, and one of the things that I want you to pay attention is that basin filled with blood here and children here in this way. And then after my book came out, there was the scandal of this painting, which was painted by an Italian painter and led to a strong condemnation from the, I believe it was the head of the Italian episcopate against the use of both the story of Simon of Trent and this blood libel in general. The cult of Simon of Trent, I'll get to it, but was abolished by the Catholic Church on the same day as the Declaration of Nostra Aetate was published in 1965, October 1965. So how did lies become historical facts that is taken by many people and treated as existing historical facts? If you are interested, there are interactive maps on the website that is related to the book, and there are also a lot of images and additional resources. But I mapped the cases which were mentioned in my sources in the way. And you can see that from the beginning of the accusations, which it was 1144, was the story of the first child who was found dead and of whose death Jews were said to be guilty of. It's a long-winded tale, but I don't want to use words that would imply that Jews did such things. And that was in Lincoln, in England, in Norwich. The boy, William of Norwich, was found dead, and then a few decades later, a story emerged blaming Jews for his death. But generally, it is considered a medieval story. And when you look at this map, before you look at the map, because the map doesn't tell you the chronology, you can see that the medieval period is actually not as frequently affected by these stories and trials as the early modern period. So the question really is why this medieval tale became an early modern fact. And I want to draw your attention to the type of sources that come about these stories. So from the medieval period, the majority of the facts of the information comes from literary sources. So these are mentions and maybe chronicles, maybe other kinds of literary writings. We have very few official documents that might suggest that something actually happened. That is, that there may have been an accusation, and then maybe a trial or some intervention happened. In the ones that are in orange, we actually don't know whether anything happened or whether these are stories that may have been invented even decades or even centuries later, as we can document some of those tales were in fact invented even centuries later. So when you then look at not just the type of sources, but whether we can tell, even through these literary sources, whether there were any legal proceedings, we only come up with a tiny minority, just a handful of cases of stories that had actually some legal trail, legal footprint. The rest really comes as stories. This is not necessarily the case for the early modern period. In the early modern period, which I date more or less mid-15th century until the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, the reason why there is 1830 is that there was one long-lasting case in Russia, in Tsarist Russia in 1830, which actually had connections with the Polish cases. So that's why it is on the map. But in general, you can see that the early modern period, the blood libel, the accusation that Jews kill Christian children to use their blood, is really not a medieval story. It is a story that emerged in the medieval period, but was in fact an early modern story, and a story of the era of print, of legal transformations. And you can see that now the majority of our information come, in fact, from legal sources, not literary sources. And in majority of these stories, they were actual trials. So a very distinct shift between the medieval period and the modern period, early modern period, not only in quantity, but also in quality, literary versus legal. In this case, there were actual people who were affected by these stories and these accusations. In terms of outcomes, if anybody of you has heard about blood libels, or sometimes a version of such accusations called ritual murder, I prefer to call it murder libel rather than ritual murder libel, because I don't want to have any implications on connections with Jewish rituals in this. But that the majority of them ended with deaths of Jews. And it is also surprising to see that, in fact, this may not be the case. In the medieval period, again, through the either literary or legal sources that we have, there is more or less equal division between, yes, Jews were killed, executed in this, or they were not, or we don't know. In the early modern period, despite the fact that we have such a huge number of cases, and we can actually say there were cases because there were legal cases, the majority of them ended with either acquittal of Jews, or even nothing happened except that Jews were accused, and then the court cases may have been dismissed. But yet, in the memory of that, in the sort of public understanding and common understanding of these stories, is that, in fact, Jews were always executed, and these accusations ended up with their deaths. And one of the reasons is how these tales were transmitted, even how the reports of these real trials were transmitted, and for what reason. And we'll see it in a moment here. And here is the breakdown for these cases, legal proceedings, and the stories as well during the period of papal condemnation. So the popes condemned such accusations against Jews between 1247, which was that yellow dot in southern France, in Valréa, in Provence, a girl was found dead and Jews were accused of killing her, and the Pope Innocent IV issued a very strong bull condemning such accusations against Jews, and then subsequent popes would reissue a version of such condemnation until 1540, when those condemnations ended. And scholars have often explained that the condemnations ended in 1540 because of the Reformation, and there were other things that were going on. And then when we look at a map of these cases here in the post-papal protection period, the majority of scholars who have dealt with this issue were studying Western Europe, and indeed it seems that this ended, but it didn't end in Eastern Europe, in Poland and what is now Ukraine, Belarus, and Lithuania. So for scholars focused on the West, the Eastern European stories did not enter the consciousness, and it seemed like, in fact, yes, Reformation may have been behind the dropping of the cases and therefore also the end of the condemnation. That turns out not to be true, and in fact, Poland was a Catholic country. So one of the explanations for that is the impact of the trial of Jews in 1475, which again persisted in that memory even in California in 2019. So as I mentioned, in March 1475, this child, 26-month-old child, is lost. And people first think that he may have drowned because in Trento there are many canals. And then finally on Easter, his body washes out under the house of a Jewish family, who finds the body and reports it to the authorities. And then Jews are immediately arrested, and the trial begins soon after. What is interesting, and this is a very interesting case of where we know how a story becomes a fact and how it enters historical consciousness, is that before the trial fully came into force, it was just in the first days of investigation and of interrogations, but not even yet under torture, not fully interrogating people in town, interrogating some of the arrested Jews. There is a full narrative that's already created that tells that Jews killed Simon. They killed him to obtain his blood, to reenact Jesus' passion, believing that the Messiah, the Jubilee year, that was going to bring Messiah and bring redemption through this. So that narrative is written on April 4th, just a few days after Simon's body is found. And when you look at the trial records, which are written much later and are organized not chronologically, but according to the actors that the bishop of the town seeking Simon's beatification or recognition of his cult organized, if you read them instead of in the order that was presented to the Vatican, to Rome, of the major actors, you see that gradually the interrogations and the testimonies are being presented to conform with the language in that narrative from April 4th. So at the beginning, there is unity in voices. Jews are denying any role. They talk. Even townspeople tell that Simon probably drowned. And gradually, as the time progresses, by June, the language, the phrases that appear in the Latin transcripts of the trials that survive converge with that printed version of the narrative that's created just a few days after his body is found. And one of the reasons is that this case, the child's death, happened in a Jubilee year when many pilgrims were going from across Europe to Rome, and the bishop in Trento wanted them to have a reason to come to Trento and created a holy site, claiming the martyrdom of the boy Simon and miracles that his relics supposedly enacted. The problem with that was that he needed Jews to be guilty of that. Otherwise, the boy could not have been a martyr. Because children couldn't be martyrs. There's a whole theological argument that I can get into, but I don't have time to now. But the guilt, by reenacting the crucifixion as it was claimed, Jews were martyring this child, so was said. And if Jews were not guilty, then he could not have been a martyr, and therefore he could not be worshipped. And that was also the position of the Pope, who sent an envoy to investigate it and deemed that it was not true, and in fact forbade the worship of Simon. And the other thing that is very important about this case is not only did it produce broadsides like this one or the one that I showed you here, but it also produced illustrated books. For the first time in the history of printing press, and this is not a long history, by 1475, the printing press is invented around the year 1450, so it's a very young technology. It's the first time in the short history of the press, where we have illustrations corresponding to the text. Before that, you might have some generic images. Here, the story in the text tells the same story as the images tell. The story of Simon enters World Chronicles. So another thing that emerges in the 1470s is the idea of world history. Before that, in the medieval period, you might have local chronicles, monastic chronicles, but this new technology creates that new genre or embellishes a new genre of these elaborate world chronicles. And in those world chronicles, the story of Simon enters towards the end, because they usually run to about the time when they are published. So at the end, Simon is added, and the story depends on the language in which the chronicles are published. So there's a different narrative in German, a different in Italian, different in Latin, and I'll explain why in a moment. It also produces iconography. And here is one of the most infamous and one of the most well-known images from Hartmann Schädel's chronicle from 1493 of the woodcut of Simon of Trent, and we'll see it again and again. But what we see is its inclusion of this story in the world narrative of world history. And finally, despite the early papal condemnations of the worship of Simon, the veneration of Simon, Simon is included in the revised, reformed calendar of the Catholic Church and the Martyrologium Romanum, the liturgical calendar. And here, under March 24th, you have a sentence added, this is in Latin, that in Trent, a passion of Holy Simon boy was cruelly killed by Jews with many miracles. And that legitimized not only the veneration of Simon, but also the existence of the supposed crime of Jews killing Christian children. And that is really one of the reasons why the popes stop issuing bulls condemning anti-Jewish accusations after 1540. So I mentioned the different languages, and I'll return to it, but there was also an iconographic language that Simon of Trent, the story of Simon of Trent developed. So what we see is three types of iconography: the so-called Passion of Simon, which really focuses on the supposed act of murder of Simon; the Simon Victima, the victim, the body of Simon; and then the Simon in Glory, emphasizing his holiness, Simon's holiness. And what we see is regional differentiation where these images are disseminated and how. Italy becomes really very a home of this iconography of Simon in Glory. The emphasis is on his glory, on his holiness, on his sainthood. And here I have two versions of very similar painting. One is when Simon is supposedly a beatus with just the rays, and then he has the halo after he's included in the Martyrologium Romanum, although he's never formally actually canonized or never formally beatified. And then north of the Alps, we have a dominant iconography, either Simon Victima, the body of Simon, and this is imagery from German pamphlets, or the killing, the supposed act of killing. And that iconography becomes, again, dominant in German publications and then in Eastern Europe. And here you have sort of a repeated visual representation of Jews in the act of murdering Christian children that come from mostly German, but also in Poland as well. And that's clearly influenced and by the iconographic language of the trial of Simon of Trent. And here is a map of where the glory is, where the murder are, and where the corpse iconography is in Europe. So how facts are made? You know part of the story through the Simon story, but there is more to it. So I've examined as many as chronicles, and really year by year, that were published before, like from the 1460s on, because I wanted to know what people knew about Jews and what was available to them in print. Not just anti-Jewish works, which I read and have written about in the book as well, but also I wanted to see how is history, how do Christians present the Jews. So in these various chronicles, we can see just a handful of stories. These chronicles start, again, from the beginning of the world, the creation of the world by God, until the year of the publication of the chronicle. And in those chronicles, there are a handful of stories. So among the stories of kings, princes, popes, wars, there are about, here in this case of the Shvidler Chronicle, about fewer than a dozen, 11 stories about Jews. And when you look, the vocabulary of the stories is very limited. It either talks about the punishment of Jews for something that they may have done. So Jews were expelled, they mistreat vulnerable sacrament, they were burned throughout Germany because they poisoned Christian springs, Jews were killed and plundered by inhabitants in Prague, and there's usually a reason why, and they were burned, and usually the act of burning or plundering of expulsion is an expiation for some kind of a purifying act by the Christian community for some supposed crime of Jews. And then Jews killed a boy named Simon of Trent, and so on and so forth. So the vocabulary and the stories about Jews in these chronicles are very limited. When you are a Christian reader who may have never encountered a Jew, who may not have even thought about Jews. Maybe you've seen them as neighbors, but you may not have thought about it. If you actually read it, you suddenly see that that's all the role Jews play in world history. It is a very limited role of Jews in the world history, and you may begin to see Jews in a different light. So here is another example from a chronicle that expelled, beaten, expelled, robbed, martyred child, and so on and so forth. Many of these chronicles signal these stories with iconography. Here is an image from the Shvidler Chronicle, the large image about the William of Norwich, whom I mentioned. And I forgot to bring my pointer, but the actual sentence about William is only one sentence, 4 lines just below the guy above Simon, whereas the image about it is the largest image on the page. The other stories are much longer, but have generic images of men, popes, or scholars. They reappear in other ways. The stories about Jews usually have very unique iconography. Here is Sebastian Münster's Cosmographia, so lest you think it's a Catholic issue, no, these stories also enter Protestant writings as well. And here is another one. So as a reader, if you see something like that, you may stop and read, and these are usually the derogatory story about Jews. Here is about poisoning of Jews, and here is a slide of me trying to figure out where these stories appear, in which edition, what versions, which corresponds to which, and if I had to print it not in a minuscule, it would have been 64 sheets of paper. So this is just to show you that. So these inclusion of these really tales about Jews, that they did something or didn't do something, we sometimes don't have any historical evidence about even that something happened in these towns, enters authoritative sources, history books, chronicles, liturgical calendars, and turns them into facts. They become historical facts that then people turn to use as historical evidence for whatever argument they might need. And I can tell you that these chronicles and these stories were in fact used in legal cases against Jews as evidence that Jews did that. Because they said, oh, we found this child drowned, but you know it's around Easter and Passover. Jews do look at all the chronicles that mention that thing. So the tales, the stories, the rumors that are heard from town to town that maybe somebody had written down, oh, I heard that Jews killed this child in Norwich, become facts when they are printed and included in authoritative sources. This example is actually quite an interesting example of how these stories are made into facts and false facts too. So, as I mentioned, Pope Innocent IV issued a very explicit condemnation of anti-Jewish accusations in 1247. This is Odorico Rinaldi's continuation of Cesare Baronio's Annales Ecclesiastici, the church ecclesiastical history. And what he did is he did exactly what Baronio did. He found an archival material, in this case, this papal bull condemning anti-Jewish accusations, printed it in this chronicle with a little introduction on top saying that in 1247, in the town of Valreas, Jews were accused of killing this Christian girl, and the Pope issued this statement. If you ever have seen Baronio or Odorico Rinaldi's publication, these are massive volumes, one huge volume per century. So for each century, Baronio has 12 and Rinaldi continues. Nobody could buy a bookshelf of that, only maybe some, libraries. So what happened is printers and scholars printed abridged one-volume ecclesiastical histories, removing all the documents and only keeping the information. Essentially, reading the headlines or Twitter feed instead of the story that you should click through and read the whole article today. So what enters the public knowledge is that in Valrennes, Jews were accused of killing a Christian girl, and not the fact that the Pope condemned it. And that's lost in history. After 1580, that is after the recognition and the insertion of Simon of Trent into the liturgical calendar, you can see a shift really of these accusations mostly in the Catholic regions. In Poland, where most of European Jews or world Jews lived, and a couple of cases in Italy. The Italian cases were actually ones which did not end up with Jews' deaths, or, even when there were, as in Viterbo, there was actually a lengthy trial. But that was not necessarily the case for Jews in Poland. Although majority of them were exonerated, in a huge number, they were in fact killed. And they were killed because the historical evidence was used against them to show supposed historical patterns to convict Jews against these crimes. And then, once they were convicted, then these stories entered Christian writings against Jews, the anti-Jewish writings, saying Jews in the town of Lublin were condemned and burned at the stake for killing this Christian, Not the stories of Jews found innocent, because anti-Jewish writers were not interested in showing Jewish innocence. So the reason why we in memory have that Jews were severely persecuted, and I don't deny it, but that they were almost always killed, is because the anti-Jewish writers were focused intentionally on publicizing the stories of Jews' punishment and not of Jewish innocence. And the cases in which Jews are found innocent are only found in the archives. So I know of them because I've seen them in the archives, and I was able to factor them on this map. But if you read through these chronicles, through the publicly published works, the majority of them speak only of those that show Jews as being punished, convicted of the crime. Here is the iconography after Simon was recognized as a beatus, again, never made a saint, but as a beatus by the process of equivalent beatification. And you can see that the majority of that iconography is the negative iconography. And the majority of our evidence is now legal, not literary evidence. As George El-Mossi said, the past becomes as is it present, and culture is really a state of habit of mind. So what I have shown you is how the habit of thinking about Jews as dangerous, as killers, as guilty of all these crimes was developed through the printing press. And one of the myths that emerged in, I can date it to 18th century, is that it was the uneducated people, the rabble, the Am Haaretz, as in Hebrew is said, who were guilty of accusing Jews of these stories. And that is not the case. It is the educated, those who could read, who were able to learn supposedly about these crimes, and who later on saw Jews in a different light. And there's one wonderful quote of a Polish writer who goes to the West and studies and reads these chronicles and comes back and says, I used to drink with Jews. I used to hang out in their inns and eat with them. I am surprised I'm still alive. I learned so much of what they did when I was studying it. right? So studying books in the West. So what we see is we have this lengthy process of creating a sort of a mental way of thinking and in a very limited way about Jews and their role and their place in Christian society. These pre-modern stories that I showed you had a modern use in a very similar way. An example of that is, and I know that some of you are in a Holocaust class, is from Der Stürmer, which was an anti-Semitic newspaper published, and this is an issue from 1934, which is devoted to the ritual murder or the Jewish murder plan against non-Jewish mankind here. And what you see the basin I told you. Remember that basin with blood on it? Here, Jews are supposedly holding a basin. There are these children. That iconography is also familiar from that cartoon I showed you, with a knife. And then there's Golgotha, the 3 crosses on that, showing you this. But in that issue, you see the use of the pre-modern chronicles and iconography that I showed you. I've showed you this Simon of Trent from the Schädel Chronicle, and then from the Raiders Bavaria Sancta, which is over there. And then that circle section is the beginning of a 3-page long analytic spread of these facts that in 1144, Jews killed William of Orange. In 1247, they did this. In 1475, they did this. And it goes on. And what the Nazis did is that they used these historical footnotes. They actually footnote. They say, this is, in this chronicle. This is in the Acta Sanctorum by the Bollandis. This is in the calendar, Martyrologium Romanum. So they are using these early modern chronicles as authoritative sources, bolstering these stories as facts. And then this iconography and these stories spread as part of the Nazi and fascist propaganda. Here is from a 1942 issue of La Difesa della Razza. You can see a reproduction of the Simon of Trent issue, and also that image from the front page of Der Stürmer. And then right at the height of the final solution, in Eastern Europe and in Germany, they are beginning to publish these books about Jewish ritual murder, the truth about Jewish ritual murder, again, using that early modern printed iconography and sources to show from their perspective that they are not making these stories up, and using these sources to justify the murder of Jews in Europe. That Nazi propaganda is the source of the obsession of that Poway shooter, because it enters the neo-Nazi white supremacist ecology of knowledge on the internet, translated into English, and that is what then entered that both the white supremacists in Britain and others, their supposed knowledge of that. Here's another example from that thing. So that's the root. It is through the Nazi ecology of knowledge. Other lessons to be learned. That leadership matters, that's for sure. When you look at the number of accusations that happened during the period of papal condemnations, but many more happened and much more brutal after the popes stopped officially condemning Jews. That silence from Rome was treated in Catholic Poland, that I can tell you for sure, as an acquiescence and an agreement that Jews are guilty of this supposed crime, and then insertion of Simon of Trent into the liturgical calendar became a proof that this was in fact a fact. The other lesson that I've learned doing this project is that diverse sources of knowledge matter. And this is, I'll return to the language sources. So when you look at that map, and this is really, I made the map later, but this is really where the initial project started, why there were so many cases against Jews in Poland and a handful, and also in Italy, and what was the response. But what I discovered is that map, the almost empty northern Europe, the handful in Italy, and a really domination in Eastern Europe, can be explained by the sources of knowledge, what people learned and what people knew about Jews. So what I call German polyphony is that in Germany you had a lot of anti-Jewish sentiments. We've seen those negative, horrible imagery of Jews shown as Jews killing these Christian children. But there were also scholars who studied Jewish ceremonies, not to necessarily admire them, to polemicize against them, to convert Jews, to show how absurd Jewish practices were. But nonetheless, these were Christian scholars who learned Hebrew language, who were able to read Jewish sources, and who were able to say, no, Jews don't do such things. In fact, Johannes Buxtorf, in his book, Synagoga Judaica, or the German version I have here, Judenschule, says, during Passover, when Jews prepare the matzah is only flour and water, and that's it. And he throws this comment, and it doesn't even taste good. Right? That's his taste. Maybe he didn't like it. Some people love it, and some people can't wait for Passover. But the point was, even in that short sentence, he was able to debunk the claim that Jews kill Christian children around Passover to get blood to add to Passover matzah. In Italy, and this may also explain why we have this focus on Simon and Glory, the Christian polemicists against Jews were interested in polemicizing against Judaism. That is not anti-Jewish polemic, but is anti-Judaic polemic in Italy. And they are saying, don't accuse Jews of such stuff because they will never convert. We know Jews don't eat blood. You know Jews don't do such things. If you say that, people will say that Christians are stupid and we can't do it. So they focus, again, based on the knowledge of Hebrew, on polemicizing against Jews, using Hebrew sources to convince them that Jesus was the true Messiah, that he came, and Jews should acknowledge that truth, and that even rabbinic sources tell, especially the Kabbalistic sources, tell that Christian truth, even in Jewish sources. So they are very much interested in the proselytism and the conversion of Jews and find these accusations detrimental. This is not the case in Eastern Europe, in Poland. In Poland, there are no Christian Hebraists who read Jewish sources and who can do what Johannes Buxtorf did, nor are they really interested in converting Jews as the Italian Catholics. What we have is anti-Jewish literature that mines these chronicles for the stories, negative stories about Jews. And that is the literature that is spread about in Poland, and that's what Polish readers can learn about Jews in Poland. And that is why we have that map with the dominant sphere of accusations being Poland and Eastern Europe. Visual culture matters. Again, Italy, very mild. There is blood, there is the knife, there are needles. It's implied there is violence there, but it's not as violent as the Northern European, Western, Eastern European iconography that shows the derogatory images of Jews in violent acts. I also want to just make sure that we understand that there was no uninterrupted line from the pre-modern sources to the Nazis, right, to that. What we see scholars in the 19th century, historians, mining medieval chronicles and medieval stories, medieval sources, and publishing them as source material for historians. And as I have shown you, many of these chronicles contain these one-liners. We heard that in Norwich, this boy was murdered, or so and so. So it enters another source of authoritative knowledge these 19th century source materials. The other thing that happens is in the 19th century, we begin to have new accusations against Jews. One is in Damascus, the first one, and another one later on, a couple of ones in the late 19th century. And when these accusations happens, scholars, both Jewish scholars and anti-Semitic scholars, go and dive deeply in the archives and publish the same documents that I've seen referenced in my sources in the early modern period. So we see papal bulls being published in defense of Jews. We see studies about Jews in various case studies here of the case in Valreas, and this is published right after the Tisa Eslar Blood Libel in 1882. The papal bulls, Moritz Stern's papal bulls, that serves as a sort of basic source for papal condemnations of blood libels, is published in 1900, a year after the Hilsner affair, in which Jews were accused of killing. In Eastern Europe, the Baylis trial that started in 1911 and ended in 1913 produces both scholarly materials in journals, scholarly sources, and also books with sources, archival sources related to these stories. In 1935, Cecil Roth published the 1759 report by the Holy Office of the Inquisition, Cardinal Lorenzo Ganganelli, who became Clement XIV, condemning or debunking these accusations. And he published it in translation in English and in the Italian original in response to this issue of der Stürmer. So what we see is historians engage with contemporary events, as Moses said, past is present, and engaging with the past to respond to contemporary accusations. And here is an example from an anti-Semitic side where, again, after the Hilsner affair, we have a study of the Saint-Vernier, who was a saint of the winters. And by the 19th century, the anti-Jewish part of the legend was lost, but it was recovered in the 19th century when these anti-Jewish trials began here, and another resurgence interest in Simon of Trent also at the end of the 19th century, early beginning. So I'll stop here. I can talk more, as you can tell, and I'll be happy to entertain any questions. Thank you. So my first book was on the Catholic Church and Jews in Poland, particularly. I was trained in Eastern Europe, in Eastern European Jewish history, and on the cover of my book is actually a painting of Blood Libel from my father's hometown. So I knew that there were accusations in the 18th century in my father's hometown. And that book raised questions for me. I looked at mostly the image of Jews as used by Catholic writers and leaders in polemic against Protestants and also against in political struggles in post-Reformation Poland. My argument was that we read about Jews, but it's not really about Jews. It's about all these other political issues, and Jews are a sort of useful tool because they provide this polemical body that can be used. But I really wanted them to see, like, what were these relations on the ground? And I started looking at some sort of more social history materials and court records, rabbinic responsa, and so on and so forth, to sort of disentangle these real relations. And that led to my second book. And that book, kind of, when I was writing, was really frustrating because I couldn't come up with a so what question. I was sitting and reading all these court records. And like, okay, so Jews and Christians, had close relations with each other and wasn't as bad as the polemical literature says. But that's not enough for a book. That's kind of a boring book. And then I was sitting in the archives and I had this eureka moment. And the eureka moment was that I was sitting and I usually, my method of studying Jewish history is that I actually read all the files and not just read the files that are related to Jews, because I want to see how Jews sort of function in that way. So I was sitting in a Polish town near the Ukrainian border in Przemysl in the archive, and I'm reading these criminal trials. And there was a case of Jews against Jews for desecrating the host in that town. But I didn't want to just look at that, so I was reading all these other cases. And the eureka moment was that the legal term used against host desecration against Jews was sacrilegio, but it was also the same term that was used against women who were stealing hosts or men who were robbing Catholic churches. Robbers just, going into churches and stealing silver. And I said, oh, that is interesting. That is not just about Jews being accused about things, but that crime and that category has a meaning. So that turned into my second book on sacrilege and Jews as part of that story. And my argument was that the trials against sacrilege helped reinforce the Catholicism in post-Reformation Poland as the true religion, because only people who committed crime against sacred objects, Catholic sacred objects, were punished severely. If you stole from a Lutheran church or a synagogue, the punishment was different. And then my editor said, you're writing about the host desecration, but you really don't talk about this other stuff that is, the other accusations that were happening to Jews. I said, well, they are not really related to it. This is a different story. I said, well, you may want to say something, because otherwise, reviewers will say, she's not paying attention to that. So I made an comment about why this is a different category and differently treated, even though in Jewish history the two were always linked together. And that led me to this book. And I don't think I have a slide for you, but when I was finishing my second book, I was in the Vatican just finishing my research just to be sure that I saw all the records I wanted to see. And I had some time left on my last day, and I'm like, well, I'm not just going to go around Rome. I should have. I said, oh, let me just order some documents just so I can see. And I requested the Trent trial, and I have one sentence about it, just a description, parchment, so many pages, and then I have not relevant for me, but it was neat to have seen it. And that was 2011, and then I ended up writing this book in which he becomes such a central character. And I thought, oh, well, I'll mention Simon in this book when I decided to write this book, but people have written about Simon. I have nothing new to say. And then it kept going, and I literally followed the trail. That is, I started in Poland, and I thought that it was going to lead me to Ukraine, because that's where many of those in the East, these trials were taking place. But it kept pulling me back. It kept pulling me back to Italy. It kept pulling me back to Western Europe. It kept pulling me back. So I ended up, as was mentioned, using sources from 8 countries in 10 languages. I ended up on paths that I sometimes abandoned, like Spain I abandoned, and some paths that I, was on in grad school, and I thought I would never end up on those paths again, but I ended up on those paths. So thank you for the question. Yeah. So it's a very good question, and I tried Spain because one of the very important books in the history of anti-Jewish polemic is Alfonso de Spina's Fortalitium Fidei. Very important, influential book. So I thought, of course, and I've heard about Del Niño de la Guardia and this, so I ended up. So I even looked at some of the Castilian early modern chronicles to see if I can see, like in these Northern European chronicles, stories about Jews, to see it, and nothing was coming up. there was one in Espina that was mentioned, the story in Castile, and then it kind of disappears. So I thought, well, there might be something. And now medieval historians are finding in the archives more documents, and they are, I get this question, why is the Spanish map empty? We know that there were these stories, and the reason why it's empty is that on all these published books, and on the website you can actually see all the source books that I consulted. The book itself only has the primary sources because the president allowed me. He said it was so long, you're not allowed to put the secondary sources in. So the full bibliography is on this website. And that's essentially why Spain, for whatever reason, was not important to Northern European chronicles. And the other thing that was shocking to me about Spain is, in Jewish history, 1492, the expulsion of Jews from Spain, is huge. Nobody mentions it until, I think, 1536 in European chronicles. So, again, maybe Iberian is, and there's one wonderful scholar, Francois Sawyer, who is working on that sort of memory of Jews in medieval Spain, who is dealing with it. But it's very interesting that Spain is kind of non-existent, and these stories don't filter into these massive authoritative sources that are found elsewhere in Europe. Yeah, that's a good question, and it's well-known scholars of the Holocaust and the 20th century that the papacy was not explicit enough in condemning what was happening in Europe with the Nazis. There was an attempt to, under Pius XI, right, of issuing an encyclical condemning anti-Semitism, Nazi anti-Semitism, but it was then abandoned. He dies, and it's abandoned in the archives and the Holy Office, but actually a draft of it exists. And then Pius XII is elected, and he has a different priorities, different interests, and I think we'll learn much more now that Pius the 12th archives have been now open and scholars are really studying it. So we'll learn more about what really was going on and how it was. But they were essentially what I can tell you is that when Cecil Roth wrote this book, issued the translation of the 18th century condemnation or debunking report, he also published a letter from 1913, and see whether I have it as a slide. I'm not sure whether I have it, but maybe I do. No, I don't. Of a letter that Baron Rothschild, Nathaniel Rothschild, who was a Jewish politician in Britain, who was intervening in the Baileys affair in Russia, and he wrote to Rome, to the Vatican, to the Secretary of State, asking whether the version that was published of the papal bull from 1247, that was published in Odorico Rinaldi's Annales, was the authentic version, and whether the report that Cardinal Ganganelli wrote in 1759 that I showed you, and it was later on published in one of those post-19th century trials in, I think, 1900, whether it was authentic as well. And the Secretary of State writes back and says that because Odorico Rinaldi was such a serious scholar, if he published it, then it means that this bull is authentic. And then he says because how did he phrase it? Because Cardinal Ganganelli used it, it can also be authenticated that way in his report. So he essentially didn't say, oh, Jews don't do such things, and they haven't done it because of the recognition of Simon of Trent in a liturgical calendar, which is a serious thing. If you say, oh, this is false, then you raise questions what else might be false. So the Pope's hands were kind of bound. So the Secretary of State, who actually is Cardinal del Val, who has a stake in the Niño de la Guardia story, issues kind of a vague saying, yeah, Jews don't do it, and the popes have condemned it, but doesn't do it in a direct way. And then Roth publishes that as an appendix in the document. Yeah. This is a fantastic question about the role of printing press of creating this sort of standard image. And in fact, there is no iconography of blood libel or ritual murder until the Trent trial and the printing press. We know of no kind of set iconography or anything like that. The images that we know, even painted images about other places, all happen after the Trent trial. So they are sometimes in medieval manuscripts, they're added later on when that iconography is disseminated. And this is the kind of evil genius of Bishop Hinderbach of Trent. He understood the power of the new technology. And he invested in it, and we have both the accounts and also letters where he says, I want this printed, and I want this image to represent Jews doing this and this and that. And the importance of that is that what may have been rumors circulated around Europe before, hey, did you, a monk traveling from England might say, oh, I don't know what you heard, but they, in the town of Norwich, they say that this, that kind of, for the first time, people can visualize it. And as we know, the power of an image is tremendous. So that becomes a kind of a reified crime, right? Because they can now see, oh, that's how Jews do it. Not only that, but you also have a wider dissemination of the image of the Jew in that kind of negative way. Now that image, Sarah Lipton has written a fantastic book, Dark Mirror, about the invention of the anti-Jewish iconography in the medieval ages, the sort of big nose, the nasty kind of face. That emerges in the 12th century in Christian iconography, mostly in manuscripts and in a theological kind of context debates. But what happens here is that gets disseminated more broadly in these books and also broadsides, right? When pilgrims go to Trento, they can buy themselves the sort of broadside, just one-page print that they can take with them home. And that, again, and we see it because there are some interesting ways of Jews being described. Oh, I don't know whether our Jews look like that, but they say that in Germany they look like this. They have big noses, and because that iconography is sort of disseminated in that way. So definitely print has a power. First of all, it invents the language, the iconographic language of Jews as these kind of killers, of Christians as dangerous enemies. And secondly, it helps disseminate and make real these imagined stories. Thank you so much. And feel free to email me if you have any other questions or comments later on. Thank you for having me. I'm really grateful and honored to be here with you.